so good to be here today. Thank you so much. A huge thank you to the organizing committee, and especially to Alfredo, who has been such a kind host to those of us who have been here. Thank you to the students who I've gotten to hang out with, and faculty and researchers over the past few days. We've had an opportunity to interact, which, as you can tell, I love to do very much. And thank you to all of you who are here, especially those of you who are educators in the room. Maybe raise your hand if you actually currently are a teacher or have been a teacher in your past career. Just deep gratitude for doing the work. I know we don't do it because we make a lot of money, right? But we do it because we love it, because we know it's the most important career in the whole wide world. So thank you for the work that you do. So I always start actually with just a definition. You know, when we started our work, I used to always talk about it as teaching because everybody knows teaching. But more recently, we've really leaned into this idea of interactions. Because I think as you read the definitions, we all know teaching is an act where we convey information. It's very important, and sadly, it's mostly what I'll be doing for the next 45 minutes. But the true power of learning and development happens in the back and forth exchanges that we have. So although I'm excited to be here and get to kick off this amazing conference, I'm much more excited to spend the next few days in community with all of you and getting to interact with you as well. So I always will like to start sort of situating us in a classroom. It's where I spend so much of my time. This is a particular classroom in Northern Virginia. I'm at the University of Virginia, which is just about 2 hours away from Washington, D.C. This is a program in Northern Virginia, which is very close to Washington, D.C. This particular program is a private child care program who serves a really broad community. They have several hundred students, and students in this preschool and early childhood program speak over 20 different languages. So they were so kind to let us into some of their classrooms, and so I'll just share this quick video with you.
We believe in the potential of each moment to unlock the power of interactions. Interactions that connect, that engage, and that inspire learning.
How about here?
Not every moment is perfect,
What's going on here? Do you want to do something?
but each of them is meaningful.
Que los pescados y las estrellas del mar les gustan. Hi, Rose.
These interactions fuel growth and development. They are the foundation of our education systems, and they impact everything we do far beyond the classroom.
All right, Michelle.
Interactions are happening all around us each and every day. So, let's work together to change the world, one interaction at a time.
I thought of this, Alfredo, earlier today when you said, I hope everything is perfect. I said, it won't be perfect, right? Nothing is ever perfect, but if we can interact and be in community with each other, then it'll be wonderful. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about a journey that I have been on with many colleagues across the United States and around the world in this work around interactions. And our work really sits at the intersection of research, policy, and practice, as I know many of you do. I spent my early career as a first grade teacher. I loved that, but at the same time I knew I wanted to go and do research. So I spent most of my career really in research, but as I'll share a little bit more about, some of our work really got pulled into the policy and practice world. And so I've spent more time in the practice and policy world, but really enjoy this rich intersection that we have sitting at the middle of that. So just a little about me. So I do work here at the University of Virginia. If you have never been, please come and join us. It's beautiful, especially in the fall. We have gorgeous trees that change colors. And back in 2008, alongside my mentor and partner, Bob Pianta, who was the dean of the School of Education for many, many years, we founded an organization to help bring some of our research out to the policy world. And so that's where I spend more of my time these days. So our first set of work really came around redefining quality, and this work really started with Bob and some of his colleagues who were part of a large national study that started back in 1991 called the NICHD Study of Early Childcare. And Bob was amongst a set of developmental researchers who were really asking, what experiences do children have in early childcare and elementary settings that are most responsible for driving their development and outcomes? And as they looked at the available research and data, they really felt like we were missing something. So at least in the United States, for many years, the sort of definition of quality, when you said a high quality program in the United States, it typically meant a program that looked very nice. It had nice materials and nice environments. And it had a teacher who might have had a bachelor's degree. And if that was your program, then you were rated as having a high quality program. We know those things are so, so important, but we also know now from lots and lots of research that they create sort of a baseline, a floor for quality. And that ultimately what happens with those materials and what a teacher actually learns in their educational experience is what really matters. And so the work that we have done has really been to say, let's look at what actually predicts outcomes. This is a paper by a former student of ours, Terry Sable. It was actually published in Science. I was not an author on it, so I can tout how amazing that is. There aren't often educational studies published in Science. And she did a really nice job of articulating the policy relevance. So she looked at the 5 most common measures of quality, and then looked at the extent to which they were related to children's gains in math, in early literacy, in language and social skills during the preschool year. And as you can see, what we found is interactions, as measured by class, were the most consistent predictor. All of those things being important, but not as connected to children's learning. And so over the past few years, CLASS, which is an observational measure that we developed at the University of Virginia, has been used to help really redefine quality because it really focuses on those interactions in classrooms. Now, I don't have a lot of time today, so I'm not going to say a lot about class. Typical class training lasts 3 days, 2 to 3 days. Anyone here who's been through a class training? I think we have a few folks, yes. And there's a test at the end, so I promise no test at the end of today. But I will try to give you just a little flavor for what class is today. So maybe we'll first start. When I say quality interactions, and you think of the preschool settings that you have spent time in, just sort of think in your mind about what that looks like. What do you imagine seeing when you think of quality? And just hold that in your mind. And then I'm going to show a video. This video actually comes from a program, a family childcare program in San Francisco, California. And maybe for some of you it will be a little different than the picture in your mind of quality, or maybe it'll be the same. So I will play this video. It's about 2 minutes long. And maybe as you watch, just try to take a note of 1 or 2 things that you think represent sort of high quality interactions.
Flower now. See the flower, the white flower? Yeah, you see waterfowl poly too. Yeah, there's lots of roly-poly in our garden.
We're not spread the roly-poly.
呢個拎佢走先。你同我揸住，俾阿 Isa 行啦。Now we have this cilantro. That's cilantro. Now spray the bottom where the soil is. The soil. Where the soil is. 妹，你係咪想要個 sprayer 啊？我攞個俾你 ，OK？ 攞個俾你 ，OK？ 攞個俾你，睇住吧，睇住。Wash your hands later, okay? Okay. Now see what plant is this? That is a strawberry plant. Look at what these are.
Flower plant.
Yeah, these are the flower, the white flower. Do you know what's inside right here? Now this is a strawberry plant, and this white flower is flower, and inside here it's a little strawberry. And this would grow and grow and grow and become a big strawberry when it turns green, and then it turns orange, and then turn red. And then when it's red, it's ready to be picked. So we're gonna look at it every day to see how it grows, okay?
I get laughs at different places in this video than when I show it normally, because most of the time people aren't understanding everything that she's saying. CLASS is an observational tool that it really focuses on 3 major areas of interactions. Emotional support, which is really about the ways in which teachers foster relationships and connections between teachers and students, but also among students. The extent to which they're really sensitive and recognize the needs of individual children, and how much they create an environment in which children are free to sort of move about and do the things that they're interested in. We also pay attention to classroom organization. It's not about how the materials are organized, but rather how teachers support children's behavioral regulation and their attention in the classroom. How much time they spend sort of engaged versus just sort of sitting aside without doing anything. And then finally, instructional support. And when we say instruction, many people immediately think of sort of math and literacy instruction, but here we're focused on very general instructional strategies that can happen anytime throughout the day, even outside, including teacher support for thinking and developmental skills, the support for feedback, as well as language development. So as I describe that, and we think back to that video, we saw many elements of this, even in that short video, and we never score after just 2 minutes, but there were many examples of emotional support. You saw her in close physical proximity to the children. You saw them really getting along quite well. Even though we call it classroom organization and there wasn't a sort of traditional inside classroom, we saw those children had something to do. They were engaged, and there's nothing more exciting for a young child than a sprayer, right? But you notice they weren't even spraying each other. They were really spraying and participating in the learning opportunity. And then when we think about instructional support, she introduced some new language like cilantro, but really in the presence of the materials themselves so that children would really remember. She wasn't just sort of abstractly teaching them. So even in these small moments, we see so many examples, rich examples of interactions. I also love that video because pretty much I've asked many people this: what do you imagine when you imagine a high quality program? And no one mentions a dog. So, you know, I don't know if you saw, but there was a dog in the video, so that was fun too. So there are sort of 2 elements that I like to talk about in terms of class. One of them is that, you know, although I've described these sort of dimensions, that's what actually receives a score on class. There's a very rich description of each of those, that if you go through the training, you learn the sort of indicators and behavioral markers. And I think this really rich description of what quality teaching looks like is a part of what's made it a very useful tool for teachers understanding how they can improve their interactions. And I'm going to play just a very short video from a colleague of mine, Dominique McCain, who lives in Dallas, Texas. She gives the best 45-second description of what class is that I've ever heard. So I'll let her tell you what class is in her mind.
I describe class as the how of an educator's job. So often, educators are told the what of their job through a variety of evaluations and a variety of observations, but very seldomly does anyone get granular enough to help them understand immediate action they can take to transform what's happening in their classroom. Class does that. From the domains down to the dimensions, down to the indicators, down to the behavioral markers, it teaches and gives a very clear path for educators of how to do their job. So to me, class is the how of an educator's job.
So besides these rich descriptions of interactions and of teaching, class also provides a score. Sometimes people wonder about this, like how can you watch something as complicated as teaching and give it a score? But we've spent a lot of time working on creating the right training and supports to make sure that we can train many people. So we've actually, over the years, we've trained more than 200,000 people, have gone through a class training and taken the certification test. We have about 30,000 people who are currently certified observers. All those people have gone through the training, but also taken the test and passed it. And the test consists, as some of you know and probably remember painfully, watching many videos and having to submit your scores on them. But this ability to provide a score for something as magical and amazing as teaching is one of the things that has allowed class to be used as a research tool, but also a policy tool that I'll describe in just a moment. So there are over 300 peer-reviewed papers using class. A few of those we conducted early on at the University of Virginia, but quite quickly there was a lot of interest in using our tool across the educational community in the United States and actually across the world. And so I got to spend fun times early in my career traveling around and training others to use class. So a lot of this research has been conducted by others. I think of most note, because class measures a pretty broad array of interactions in the classroom, we do see that it connects to both academic outcomes as well as social emotional learning outcomes, as well as making sure that children are getting the most out of the school day. Of course, I always say it can't predict math and literacy outcomes if there isn't math and literacy happening. So it's not the only thing that matters in classrooms, but certainly alongside a good curriculum, interactions are really, really important. So with 300 studies, I won't cover them all. I'll just highlight a few of my favorite. And this is my favorite not just because it's from a former doc student, but because I really love it. Also, her name is Bridget, so how can you not love another Bridget H? But she, there's good research, not a part of this paper, but prior research that shows being in childcare settings is very stressful. Right? I mean, we can imagine you're 3 or 4 and you go from your home every day to this environment where there's lots of children and chaos and you are expected to do things. It's a stressful thing. But what we find is that when there is higher emotional support, children are less stressed. And what I particularly love about this study is, as some of you probably know, the way that we measure stress in young children, because it's hard to ask a 4-year-old if they're stressed, is through measuring their cortisol, through their spit, through their saliva. So I always love this idea that you can really understand the power of interactions, even in the sort of physiology of children. Another favorite of my studies, another former student of Bob Pianta's, Tim Kirby and some of his colleagues, was really based on some of the developmental research that tells us that we know in parenting in particular that interactions are important, but the consistency of interactions is important. Meaning, it's important not just that we have teachers who greet us and are warm and kind, but that we can expect them to be like that all the time, so that or at least most of the time, so that it isn't that my teacher's very kind one day or 1 hour and then very mean another, right? That consistency really matters. And so they were able to show this in research that the average level of emotional support predicts positive outcomes, but above and beyond that, when we are there for a couple of days, the consistency matters as well. So it's just a nice replication of some of the parenting literature that I think is relevant in classrooms as well. And I'll have one final study, as I said, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. Class has been used internationally. And one of the most impressive studies, that was a longitudinal study that was conducted by IADB, the International Bank in Latin America, and they did something the United States is very hard to do. They actually randomly assigned children to classrooms. So it gives us a slightly stronger sort of causal evidence when we're looking at the correlation between what's happening in classrooms and outcomes for children. And as you can see here in that context, which was done in largely rural parts of Ecuador in 1st and 2nd grade, that you see still we have the power of these interactions predicting positive outcomes for children's learning. So here are just a few examples of research from across the world. There's about 50 countries that have used class at this time. You'll see some examples of research conducted in China, and also some recent research conducted right here at this university that did a scoping study of research on class. And we do generally find pretty consistent findings that interactions matter. At the same time, we know, and I think we'll get to hear much more today, that by no means is class a singular measure of quality across many different cultural contexts. We're always very careful to say that we developed class very specifically for the United States context. Even that is incredibly diverse. And so we know there's really important cultural variations, and I've gotten an opportunity to talk to some faculty and students who've used CLASS here in Hong Kong about some of what may work a little bit differently in different cultures. So much more to find out. At the same time, I think because of the consistency generally of findings of predicting positive outcomes, I think we have strong understanding, and it's not a surprise, that interactions really matter. Exactly what those look like and how they work in different cultures and contexts varies in incredibly important ways. So it's so fun to work with international colleagues who are helping me understand and learn more about that variation and what might make more sense in certain cultures than others around interactions. So we knew we can measure interactions, but the next set of work really was a call to action for us, because we also know that too few children experience them. So this is sort of an overall representation of what we see across many, many, many studies in many settings across age levels. In general, we see emotionally supportive classrooms that are sort of in the mid to high range. We score classroom on a 1 to 7 scale, so you can see the distribution is really towards the high end. Very rarely do we see classrooms that are consistently over time really negative or unsupportive of children's emotional development. Classroom organization sits sort of in the mid-range. We see a little more variability there. And instructional support is consistently quite low. This is generally representative of early childhood. If you look across older grades, you actually see instructional support is a little higher. Emotional support is a little bit lower. But you still see, in general, this pattern of emotional support being the strongest across grade levels. I often get asked, why is instructional support so low? And I would say there's sort of 3 reasons. Some classrooms, all of these things are happening, some just one of them. And again, this is at least true in the United States, so I really speak from that perspective here. In some classrooms in the United States, educators have really been trained that their job is to set up the environment and let children play. And we have many educators who tell us they have been told in their teacher education program that interacting is actually interfering with children's learning. So they really have this mental model that we want children to play and we don't want to interfere. Now, of course, we want children to play, but adults have a special role in facilitating that play. Sometimes we see classrooms with very, very rote instruction. So children sitting for long periods of time, 3- and 4-year-olds sitting for an hour listening to a teacher, just tell them and ask what number something is or the color, very rote sort of questions. And again, we know a little of that is okay and fine, but for 3- and 4-year-olds, all rote instruction is very unlikely to really support their development and learning across all the important outcomes that we're interested in for young children. And then sometimes actually, and this happens at least in the United States more often than we might think, children spend the vast majority of their time doing very little. So as a part of some of the early studies that we did with CLASS, there were also some time sampling measures. And the average preschool child spent about 40% of their time in routine activities or transition, or essentially doing very little, right? So sometimes instructional support is low simply because children don't have opportunities to engage in sort of cognitively supportive interactions. We also know in the United States that not all children have equal access to quality. So children living in high poverty communities are more likely to experience low quality instruction. And in one study that followed children from kindergarten through 3rd grade in rural North Carolina and Pennsylvania, they found that just 4% of children had what they termed sort of good enough quality across all of those years. For those of you who know the class, good enough quality was defined as sort of a 5 on a total score, so it was fine, not great, but only 4%. And in fact, only about 50% of the children in that study actually got a teacher of sort of good enough quality in even a single year across those ages. So we know we have a lot of work to do to make sure more and more children have access to the kinds of interactions that we know matter so much. Here's some data from some international studies. This was pulled together, I forgot to add the citation, but I will do that when I share it, from a recent chapter that was published around international uses of CLASS. I think it's very important to say that I put this up here not for comparison sake, because these data were collected in a very different context. These are all sort of pre-K data, but they may have been conducted in different settings, et cetera. But here I just show that we see the same general pattern most of the time, with emotional support being highest, followed by classroom organization, and instructional support being somewhat lower. And of course, our colleagues in Finland can help tell us why instructional support is so high there. Actually, not to pick on the Finns, but there are some of my colleagues in Finland, Maria Christina and others, were some of the first to use CLASS internationally. And when we talk about cultural variations, one of the things that they told us is there's a dimension of emotional support called negative climate. And it really measures when a teacher yells or makes threats or sort of is physical with children. And they said, and this is true in some other cultures as well, that that's not a particularly useful scale for them. And they joked, they said, it's not like Finns are never negative, but never in public in the classroom. So maybe that is a part of why their scores are higher. So we know that we have more to do, and so our research pretty quickly turned to how can we support educators, because we know the problem is not that educators are not doing a good job, right? It is very clear that educators have not been given the supports themselves that they need to be able to support these kinds of interactions. At least in the United States, some of the problems I would say is we know even if degrees are required for early childhood educators, they typically aren't very correlated with class scores or with interactions, which doesn't mean it couldn't be. It just means that if you look at the curriculum that most educators go through in teacher education, a lot of it is very theory-based, and very little really trains them around important things like behavior management and forming relationships with children, providing feedback. So our degree system is not really working to prepare students, teacher education students, for this kind of interaction. We also know this poor teacher probably represents most teachers. In fact, my girls, I have 10-year-old twins. I have a teacher at their elementary school, Miss Bushing, who's an amazing teacher, and she hates professional development. She hates professional development so much that she told her entire class that she calls in sick every time they have a teacher work day. So Ms. Bushing, not a fan of professional development, but many of you may have been through professional development and understand why, right? Because most of it is boring, disconnected from their typical work. Many times all the faculty are pulled into one session to learn something that, you know, if you're the PE teacher or the art teacher, is totally irrelevant to your job. So it's not really working and sort of wasting teachers' very precious time. Thirdly, we know teaching is very, very stressful, right? And we've seen that before COVID, but we see it even more now. Teachers are stressed, they're isolated. There was just a recent report released by EdUHK that talks about the levels of teacher stress. And it really is at a high and causing lots of issues with recruitment and retention of teachers. So I always want to make sure when I talk about this work, sometimes people look at the results and say, you know, we really need to be getting better people into the classroom, and it's really not about that. We need to be doing a better job to make sure that educators have the supports they need to thrive. So our work really turned to that question. So starting in about 2004 at the University of Virginia, we started experimenting with different models of professional development. One of the first was this video-based coaching model called My Teaching Partner. I know it's far too small to see, but the way that MTP works is a teacher has a camera in their classroom. Now it's just a phone, but at the time it was a very old school camera that actually had digital cassettes, just to date myself a little bit. And they would film themselves in the classroom. One of the really important things about My Teaching Partner is they could film themselves 10 different times, right? We didn't care. We wanted them to send something that they felt good sending to their coach. So they would film themselves. They would send that tape at the time through FedEx to us at the University of Virginia. And one of the coaches at UVA would watch the video, and we would watch about 30 minutes, but we would isolate just 3 sort of 45-second to 1-minute clips that focused on a particular dimension of teaching practice that we had agreed with the teacher to focus on. The teacher then got an opportunity to review those short videos, and there was a brief question, sort of reflection and question. So they got an opportunity to sort of reflect for themselves. And then the teacher and coach would meet together, sometimes in person, but often on the phone or over the internet, to discuss and make a plan for the next. So that cycle of feedback happened about every 2 or 3 weeks over the course of a year. There are now about 20 published papers on MTP, both in early childhood and actually also in the secondary setting. And we consistently see that this kind of professional development, where teachers are really getting an opportunity to reflect on their own practice, on things that matter to them, to see examples of the ways that when they change their interactions, it impacts the children that are they're working with right at that moment. That it improves the quality of their interactions, but also improves outcomes for children. So that's really important. And we've been doing some work more recently around trying to scale up My Teaching Partner. As we did MTP, I remember I was talking to one of my friends from California who was at the time in the policy world. And she said, I'm glad that you're doing all this work around coaching, but could you do more on pre-service education? Because I'm tired of spending money. She worked at the state government. I'm tired of spending money to sort of rehabilitate teachers is sort of what she said, meaning they should be learning what they need to learn in their teacher education system. And so we worked on designing essentially a course, but that could also be delivered as a set of workshops sort of in post after a teacher becomes a teacher, to try to be more explicit with teachers about interactions to help them learn and understand what those look like. That's a program we called Making the Most of Classroom Interactions. Also several published papers both on the impacts of on teaching practice in our randomized control trial and also in some work that happened at the state level in Georgia and Florida. As we did this work, and I talked about this a little bit with students yesterday, we were really interested in the sort of model. Why were certain professional development things working or not? I won't spend a lot of time talking about this today, but what I would say is this part about seeing what good teaching looks like has been really, really important. Teaching is so isolating, right? And most teachers don't get an opportunity to really see what teaching looks like in other places and contexts. And it's very hard just to have a coach come in, take some notes and observe, and then tell you what they saw. It's much more powerful to be able to watch yourself teach, watch other people teach. So that part of seeing interactions we think has been very important. And we've actually developed some measures that help us assess whether a teacher is getting better at seeing effective interactions. And it seems to help explain some of the effects that we're getting from our professional development studies. So we know we can help educators, but how can we have an impact on the real world? One of the things that I think I have always appreciated is, you know, as an academic, often we count our success by the number of publications that we have, the number of students that we have. But I like to think that true impact comes from the number of educators who have known and seen our work, that it's impacted them in a positive way. And I know that I can't do that sort of sitting in my university office. It really requires us to get out in the world and talk with those folks who are experts in policy and practice, and to develop with them a shared understanding of how some of the things that might have come out of the university could have an impact in their local contexts. So this kind of happened to us. I won't say it was entirely intentional. Back in 2007, I was in my office at the University of Virginia, and Bob said, you know, I just got a message from the Office of Head Start, which is a federal early childhood program in the United States. And he said, they want to talk to us about something. Do you want to come to my office and find out what it is? I said, sure, I'll do that. So we go in, and they start by saying, well, I don't know if you know this, but CLASS has just become a part of the federal Head Start system. It's actually a mandated tool as a part of the accountability system. We had no idea, right? But it was people who had read a lot of research, policymakers who had read research on CLASS and were looking for something that could help them ensure that Head Start programs were offering high quality educational experiences for children and families. And so the Office of Head Start adopted CLASS as something that they call their monitoring system. What that means is if you run a Head Start program, every few years you have somebody from the federal government come and do observations in your classrooms. If you have a program that has 50 classrooms, they may just come observe about 20 of them. And you have to reach a certain threshold on CLASS, or else you have to recompete for your funding. So you don't lose your funding automatically, but you do have to sort of recompete against other folks. So it is a very high stakes accountability system as it's used in the Office of Head Start system. It was also adopted as a part of what's called quality rating and improvement systems in the United States, which now every single state except 2 have these quality rating and improvement systems. And the idea behind those is to make sure that parents have access to high quality programs. They also exist in many other countries across the world. And what you see here as a map is those states who are using CLAS as a part of their quality rating and improvement system. And we've also actually worked with our partners in Montreal and Quebec who are also using CLAS as a part of their system. So we now have great versions of videos in French if anyone's interested. So as we did this work, one of the things that we've had the opportunity to do is learn alongside our partners. And I've probably learned the most from our partners who adopted CLAS as a part of the state system in Louisiana. Louisiana, for those of you who aren't as familiar with our geography, is in the southern part of the United States. New Orleans is a very famous city and a lovely city if you haven't been there. They adopted CLAS back in 2014 as a part of their quality rating improvement system. But they implemented CLAS quite differently than I described in Head Start. So in Louisiana, if you run a child care program, if you have any children in your classrooms who have federal or state funding, all of your classrooms are observed not just every few years, but every year, and actually not just once, but twice. So all of these parishes, as they're called, that's the sort of like a county in Louisiana, all of the programs, whether they're child care, Head Start, or state pre-K that are sitting in K-12 systems are observed multiple times a year. And interestingly, they also make sure that those observations are conducted by local people who work in those communities. Frankly, when they first told us that this was their plan, we thought it was a really bad idea. We thought, how could local folks be reliable on the tool? We were really concerned about the reliability. But I think Jenna Conway, who ran the system at that time, had a theory in her mind about how important it was to make educators in those programs and leaders in those programs feel like this was something that was useful to them, that they understood it and knew, as opposed to something that was being imposed upon them at the state level. And I think that really has played out. And we've actually done research that shows those local ratings are as predictive of outcomes for children as some of the ratings that we might make at the University of Virginia. So we've really validated that approach. So what you see here over time is more and more children have gotten access to high quality programs. So you can see the sort of darker blue represents higher class scores. They use a total score of a 5 as a sort of threshold that they're looking for. So you can see up until the pandemic in 2019 that they were really making progress in making sure that more children had access. And this chart on the right is really important for us as well. You know, in our I don't know why I keep going back to Finland, but when some of our Finnish colleagues came and visited, I had a 2-year-old at the time, and I took them around to various childcare centers, and I made a comment when I was doing that said something like, you know, this is what every parent in the United States does. They travel around to a bunch of different childcare to try to find one that's of high quality. And they said, you know, that would be pretty atypical in Finland because you can pretty much assume that the place that is most convenient is the place that will provide high quality. So you don't have to go searching out high quality. And I think that's the dream that all of us have, right? We want parents to be able to choose the place that has the right cultural fit for them, that has the right hours. But unfortunately, that's not true in the United States. So what you see on this chart is that if you think of the 3 major sectors of childcare in the United States, there's sort of private childcare, which can be for-profit or nonprofit. There's Head Start, which is a federal early childhood system. And then there's state pre-K, which is typically sitting in elementary school settings and funded by the state. All of these programs have 4-year-olds in them. But what you can see is when they started their initiative, the quality of classrooms was much higher in the state pre-K programs in elementary schools. And that's not a surprise because those programs have many more resources to be able to support and train their teachers. But what you can see, although there's still a gap, is they've been sort of closing that gap. So the biggest improvements of quality have happened in the private childcare sector. And I always love, there's a parish in Louisiana called Rapides Parish. And I was meeting with the superintendent there one time, and he told me that the power of the data for him at the local level was to say, all of these children are mine. right? They're going to come here in kindergarten, they'll all be mine, whether they're sitting in childcare or Head Start, and he looked at data that looked like that at his local level, and he used some of his own funding, his sort of title funding that he can use for professional development, to support professional development for childcare in his community. And that's very atypical in the world in which we live, because school districts mostly think of their kids as the ones that are sitting in their building. So I think having some of this data has been very helpful in helping communities really think of themselves as a broader community working together to support all children. But it's not all working. So here you see data that is collected as a part of that federal monitoring system in Head Start, as I described, from 2010 to 2018. And what do you notice? Not a lot, right? So their scores on class have remained very, very consistent. And though we don't have sort of strong quantitative evidence to explain why, I think we understand very deeply that the implementation of the tool matters very much. So as I described, if you're in a Head Start program, if you have 20 of your classrooms are observed, you don't get any of that data back. You get back a single score that represents your overall program quality. So it's really not useful for anyone for professional development. And although we worked with the Office of Head Start to make sure that folks have free access to a lot of the kinds of professional development resources we have, we found that really hasn't been sufficient at a scale level to make sure that people are improving the quality of their interactions. We've most recently sort of re-engaged with the Office of Head Start, and they've made some policy changes to help make sure that class is used more as a quality improvement tool and not just as a sort of got you accountability tool. So we hope that over time we'll start to see more changes. And they're really influenced by the work in places like Louisiana. So as I said, I think a part of what we've learned from our partners is this idea that we can't use class just as a measurement tool. And we really knew that from the first day. I was always impressed with Bob the very first time we were in those conversations with the Office of Head Start. He said, you can't just invest in this as a measurement tool. It has to be an improvement tool. That led us to all of a sudden needing to train 5,000 people in the next 3 months around class for professional development. So he didn't know what he was asking for, but it was incredibly important. It hasn't been as impactful as we would like it to be, but we've gotten better at making sure people understand, and especially the policymakers that we work with, that if they're going to implement, they can't just implement on the accountability side. I think we've also gotten really good and learned so much from our local partners. I had the pleasure to hear from Susan a little bit about some of the work she was doing in Australia with case studies, and I think it's so important to understand how this actually looks at the program level. Berry Cherry Tree is a child care center in New Orleans, Louisiana. It's run by this incredible woman, Paula Polito, whose grandmother actually started the center in 30 years ago. They have many teachers who've worked there for 30 years. And Paula will tell you that class really transformed her center. And she can explain the sort of why behind that. And a lot of the why is, she describes having educators who've been there for 30 years. They didn't have a formal degree. But suddenly class gave them a pathway and a way to improve their interactions. And she really sort of bought into it whole scale and didn't see it as something that was happening to her, but something that she truly believes has made her program a better program and is better supporting the children and the families that she serves. For those of us who may be more on the quantitative side and worry about data, one of the things that's happened in Louisiana and now in places like Virginia is that alongside the local ratings, they are also doing sort of third-party observational checks. So some third party, sometimes a university, we do that work sometimes if we need to, observes just a subset of the classrooms and provides feedback. So if there's a big difference between the local ratings and the third-party ratings, then the local folks get some feedback and make sure that they're calibrating. And in Louisiana, they've actually shown that has increased the sort of accuracy of class scores at the local level over time. So that's a very useful tool. And over time, you can sort of get rid of some of that third-party observation as it becomes a higher fidelity tool at the systems level. And then we never get it right the first time, right? So we're always concerned if states or other programs say we want to ramp up to the state level and make sure everybody starts doing this right away. It's never a good idea, right? Because things always go wrong. So I think we are very thoughtful about designing pilots, sort of testing, getting feedback, and making sure that we're implementing it as a system that works well in that local community. One of the other things that we've done, which I think is different than I tended to think when I was sitting sort of in my university office, and I talked with some of the students about this idea before, which is sometimes we just design things that we think are going to be impactful, and we don't think about the context in which we're working. And that makes them hard to scale. So as I said, we designed this course on effective interactions. It got some use at scale, but it was very hard to use at scale because why would teachers participate, right? But we know that many early childhood teachers in the United States have to get this particular credential. It's called the Child Development Associate Credential. It's sort of the lowest level, lower than an AA or a BA degree. And many states require this credential to be able to teach in the early childhood system. So we worked with KinderCare, who's a private child care provider, to integrate interactions and integrate class into the CDA. So we weren't adding additional work for educators, but really infusing it in something that they already had to do, that they, in this case, get college credit for, so that it becomes a meaningful part of their professional learning, as opposed to just something separate that we're asking them to do. We've put about 20,000 educators through that course who've gone on to get their credential, and worked really hard also to make sure it was offered in a way that was accessible to the educators. So as you can see, about 70% of them completed entirely on their cell phones, often in just sort of 5-minute snippets on the bus or at nap time, because that's the time that they had to be able to complete it. Sadly, we saw data that many of them were doing it at 11, 12 o'clock at night, which is not what we'd want, right? But many of these are women who have families of their own and couldn't sort of get to that work until late at night. But probably most importantly, as an organization that cares a lot about interactions, it was important for us that we had facilitators. So although the learning is sort of asynchronous and people can do it on their own, we have facilitators who are there to be the cheerleaders and supports of educators. And we heard just amazing stories, especially during COVID, about how important those folks were. They were the people who the educator could call and say, I'm behind, I'm not gonna get this done on time, can you give me an extension? And we would always say yes, of course. So those folks who can help provide the emotional support that educators need, given the very tough job that they have. So, we'll always be on this learning journey, and we also know there's just so much more to do. Anyone who works for me, my students, the people who work with me at Teachstone, know I'm passionate. I always have more ideas for the things that we can do, but there's so much opportunity in the world. So we're really interested in some of these newer innovations. I think as we think about these innovations, I am really working to center my work and the work of our organization in the sort of middle of this policy, research, and practice community. One of the things that I think is important is, as a researcher, we sort of went in with a set of outcomes that were important to us. And as we've done some of this work, we've really worked to make sure that we're talking about the kinds of outcomes that are important in the communities that we serve. So we do a lot of work, for example, in Head Start with tribal communities, and have done lots of work with educators and leaders there to understand what's most important to them, what are the most important outcomes for them, so that we can focus on the kind of interactions that are most supportive of those kinds of outcomes. I won't talk through all of these, but I will just say, as a person who was trained as a clinical and school psychologist, I was trained very quantitatively. I really wasn't trained to be a partner to policymakers and practitioners. And now in the United States, there's much more attention to research practice partnerships. But I will say that having been a part of those, there's still often researchers going and looking for a community to do work with them, and then, publishing their results and then leaving. I think what we really need more and more of, and there's some really great examples of this in places like Chicago and San Francisco, is long-term partnerships between researchers and communities where we're really centering ourselves on their problems of practice, not the things that we're interested in publishing. I think, but it's very hard, I know, because oftentimes our academic communities don't value that kind of research. It doesn't count as much for promotion, so I think there's work to do to change the culture of academia to make sure we're really supporting this kind of learning. So I'll just end with a few things I'm excited about as I showed those maps of Louisiana. That you saw the data ended in 2019. We just got data more recently and have seen, I don't have it yet on maps, but we see the quality of settings has continued to improve even through COVID, which we think was important, and actually even through an administrative change. So they had a new state superintendent who changed a lot of policies, but actually really kept this early childhood work because there was such support for it at the local level. I don't know if this is true for you, but every conference that I've been to of late talks about artificial intelligence and machine learning, yes. In fact, I was at a conference earlier this year, which was a little bit more of a practitioner conference, and there was somebody who was talking about how they had this goal that high school students should just have to attend 2 hours a day for 4 days a week, and learn everything they needed to learn, and we didn't need teachers. All we needed is some people to monitor them on their computers. So I called my 17-year-old and I said, if I could tell you you only had to go to school 8 hours a week, would you be interested? And he was like, that sounds horrible, right? Like, that's not really what our teenagers want to do. But at the same time, we know that artificial intelligence is really going to transform the experiences of children and of educators. I have a thesis along with some others, and I've validated this a little bit with people who know far more than I. You know, I think artificial intelligence will get better more quickly at teaching children the sort of discrete skills. Imagine being a kindergarten teacher in the United States. You might have 24 children coming in at all different reading levels. It's very hard for that teacher to individualize the support that each of them needs. And artificial intelligence and some of these new tools are going to get really good at helping individualize instruction. But those interactions, connecting, engaging, inspiring children, social development, those things are going to, I hope, require humans for a very long time. That said, we know there's really interesting innovations that can happen in our work. So there's already several published papers that have looked at using artificial intelligence to score classroom videos. It's not perfect yet, right? So they might have correlations of sort of 0.4. We're not ready to displace human scorers. But over time, we think those tools will get better and better. Maybe less for sort of high accountability systems, but certainly for things like coaching. So we think actually that's a place where this work will impact us more quickly. My teaching partner is a pretty time-intensive intervention, so coaches have to watch 30 minutes of video for every teacher, and there's some work happening now at the University of Virginia that says, can we use AI not to score the videos, but to tell the coaches which little minutes to look at to make their work more efficient so that they can spend more of their time actually having the interactions with the teachers that we know matter most. This little picture comes from a company, I think it's in France, but it's run by some Turkish folks. So it's not our technology, but they have already gotten pretty advanced in measuring interactions. So they were able to sort of follow individual children, measure how frequently children were in physical proximity to adults and to other children. They were using the technology to send videos back to parents so that you could get sort of automatic videos at the end of each day from your own classroom. So they weren't using it at all for scoring at this moment, but lots of innovation happening, and I imagine there's some folks in this room who are doing that work. And lastly, I'm excited, you know, as I said, I have a 17-year-old, and he's had some really great teachers, and he's had some really awful teachers. And as I think we all have, and middle and high school were particularly bad. And so we know interactions aren't only important for young children, they're important for all of us. And more recently, we actually have versions of the class that go up to the secondary level. We have lots of research validating those tools, but it's used much less at the sort of practitioner level. But we just started a new partnership with Teach for America, which is a teacher training program in the United States, and they're starting to use class as a measure and a support for all of their folks across the grades. So we're really excited about opportunities as we think about wanting to provide children access to high quality, not just when they're 4, but when they're 5, 6, 7, 8, and across that continuum. And I'll just end by saying I'm also excited to learn more from you. So thank you very much. I've tried to leave some time for questions if you have them. And otherwise, we can just talk over coffee. But I will say, if there's anyone who has questions, happy to take a few questions or comments. Yes?
The Head Start data stay as flat as they do because there's so much turnover?
That's a great question. The average child care or Head Start program has about a 50% annual turnover rate, so turnover is very, very high. But that's equally true in sort of child care in some of the places in Louisiana. So I think that's less relevant. I think it really has to do more with Head Start does actually provide a lot of access to free sort of coaching and PD resources, but they're used very variably across Head Start communities. So I think that's part of the reason. They have lots of things to focus on, and not all of them have decided to focus as intensively on class as some of the others. In fact, sadly, we often at Teachstone get requests sort of the year right before a Head Start program is going to be assessed. They call us and they want us to come do like test prep, as if we can like come in and train their teachers in 5 minutes and have them be ready for the assessment, which we tell them doesn't really work. So. I would love to have that data. I don't think we have great data like that, but it's a great question, and we should understand more about that. Yes, thank you. Other questions? Yes, back there. And it's kind of bright, so if I don't see you, please make noise.
I've got a question. Class, do you have any kindergartens or preschool settings here in Hong Kong that are using it? And if so, what are their experiences? I represent actually the sector, so I'm very interested. Thank you.
I wonder if maybe Alfredo, or can you or somebody in your...
All right, thanks for that. We're using it in a large-scale study. So far, we've videotaped 100-odd classrooms and involving about 1,600 children. Yeah. And there's a second phase of that going on as well. And in that second phase, we're tracking children over 3 years. Yeah.
But really just, I think, for research at this moment, yeah. And I do know, I was talking to some of the folks that are working on your project, Gary, that say that, there are important cultural contexts to understand. And so somebody here could probably say this better than me, but, for example, the early childhood teachers that they're working with feel very responsible for the literacy and math outcomes and do tend to do more direct instruction. And so we need to understand more about the way that we measure. Is that really related to the outcomes that are most important to them? So I think much more to learn and understand. And there's many more people in this room who know far more about that than I do.
So I'm Echo. Have met Bridget before in the Stanford doc yesterday. So actually, I have conducted a scope review, which is work with Alfredo about how class used in China. So based on our review of around 54 articles, the performance share the same scoring pattern, which is highest in ES, emotional support, and lowest in instructional support. So I just wonder whether you can share your successful experience. After the evaluation, we found that the low performance in instructional support, how we can help teachers to improve.
Yeah. Well, I think here the cultural context matters a lot, right? So one of the things we talked about yesterday is what is the mindset of the educator, what are the expectations that they have? For example, it would probably not be the great idea to just show them a bunch of videos about high quality instructional support if that's very different than what they feel is being expected from them in the community. So I think I don't think I can answer your question. I think I have far more questions for you, and we'll be excited to hear from you. But I do think, maybe just one thing I will say, I do think videos are so powerful. So I know somebody yesterday was asking me about how we've collected so many videos, but the more you can do to collect local videos of what quality looks like in your context, I think really helps people better visualize what it could look like. So, yes.
Hi, I'm a kindergarten operator. Actually, I learned about staff maybe 10, 12 years ago in New York at train, but I didn't go through the observer certification, but my colleague did. So what we use is for staff evaluation and reflection. I think it's pretty helpful. So when we do the peer observation, and also the staff evaluation, self-evaluation. So I think it's a helpful tool that helping our professionals, to remind ourselves what is a quality interaction or quality learning.
Yeah, can I ask you a follow-up question? What do you think, what's different about using class than other things you might have used? Like how has class been useful for that self-evaluation or peer evaluation?
I think that teachers are more reflective in terms of, more the soft, the process indicators, the one that we more the interaction, how they, the infant one, how they have to do the talk, walk around, things like those kind. I think it's it's new. Actually, 12 years or 15. I don't remember. I think it's 12 years ago. I think that I was trained in New York, and then because of the Head Start, they required to do so. Then I came back and put all the tools, and I say, oh, pretty good for this. And also, I think it's for process indicators is very important. For that.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that educators and leaders often tell us is, one of the things we always say, in My Teaching Partner, we're almost always focusing on things that the teacher is doing well. So it's not about calling them out, it's about helping them have a language to understand the things they're doing, which they might not have even known, right? So we talk about having open-ended questions or prompts as one sort of indicator. Educators do that all the time, but they may not recognize that they're doing it. They may not be doing it as intentionally. So I think a part of class just helps give them a new language and understand some of the things that they're doing well. I love that. I'll have to learn more. Yes, back here.
Thank you for the amazing talk. I used to join one of the focus group asking parents' opinion regarding the childcare quality. One of the questions parents ask us is, how closely do you think the score reflects what usually is going on in the classrooms? Because sometimes the assessment, maybe it's like 1 to 2 hours, but we can't do that for every day for the classrooms. So parents ask that question. So I would love to hear what would be your response to that.
So just so I understand, you mean because if we're just doing a short observation, it's maybe not representative of what's happening on a typical day? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Or all the time?
Yeah. For example, if we do that once a year, what's going on or how is it that's consistent of what the teachers usually do as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so one of the things I always remind folks is if you look at the effect sizes of class, they're really quite small, right? When we look at the effect of interactions on outcomes. But we do have to remember that we're typically observing for 2 hours, maybe just a single day, and then using that score to predict outcomes across the year. That tells us there's probably some stability, right? That 2 hours does tell us something that's probably happening fairly typically. When we've done studies where we've observed for multiple days, we do find that in early childhood programs, a 2-hour observation gives you a representative sample. Now again, more observation is better. That's one of the reasons why AI can be particularly powerful to help us observe more often. And interestingly, as you go up in the grades, you have to observe for more. So there was a study run by the Gates Foundation called Measures of Effective Teaching, and they suggested for both class, but some other observational measures that you really needed to observe about 4 different lessons because there's more variability in what's happening in a sort of elementary or high school classroom day to day than there is in a typical early childhood classroom, at least in the United States.
Thanks so much.
Yes,
Thank you.
of course. To answer more questions.